I always want the praise at the end. Thank you. And this is the first joke. Let's see. The real joke is if I can't get it off. That is interesting. There we go. Okay. Less interesting. Thank you all for coming. It is absolutely wonderful to be here this evening. And it is much better to be here for longer than one evening, which is the experience we get to have as fellows. The Academy has provided a really remarkable intellectual and cultural experience for me and also for my family, which includes my wife and my 4-year-old and my 8-month-old, who are profiting from everything here. So thank you. We're all very grateful. I've already learned a lot from my wonderful group of fellows, not least of all after the applause that I heard at Adam's presentation, "Don't be the one to give the talk after the writer." So, my task tonight is to say something terse about data, and it's a hard job. This is one of those subjects about which we simultaneously know too much and too little. Like it or not, data is the air we breathe. So a big part of my job here tonight is to create some distance from a very familiar subject, and my approach may be something of a surprise. Since I'm a historian, my form of finding distance is going to be temporal. You'll be hearing a lot tonight about the 17th and 18th centuries. The research I'm presenting tonight comes from a book in progress called Toward a Quantitative History of Data, and the book is, in effect, a biography of the word. It's meant to be short and to have 3 movements, of which I'll be discussing mostly the first tonight. The first section concerns the adoption of the word data into modern languages from Latin, and the great revolution in usage that took place around 1750, when data first took on a modern sense. The second section of the book deals with the following 2 centuries up to about 1950, a period in which data developed greater specificity in purchase, but during which it remained largely a specialist term. The third section deals with the contemporary world since 1950, and especially the networked world since 1970, when data became an everyday concern. I call the book a quantitative history because my goal is at once to explore the history of data and the implications of data-driven methods in the humanities. The research for the book, as you'll see, involves a constant, if sometimes quixotic, dialogue between quantitative and qualitative approaches. And today's presentation, I hope, gives you a foretaste of how that will work throughout the book. As I've already noted, and as the curve of the Google Ngram before you suggests, in contemporary culture, data is happening. It seems you can't open a newspaper or a magazine these days without finding numerous stories about the importance of something called data in our lives. Consider any number of stories ripped from the headlines. Let's see if this works. Such as this one from the New York Times on data aesthetics, or this one on personal data, or this one on dream data, or this one on security data, or this one on electronic self-tracking, or this one on big data in consumer profiling. Very creepy article if you've read it about how Target knows you're pregnant. Data, it would seem, is less a kind of thing than a kind of environment, even a name for our times. In this regard, I would point, for example, to the highly publicized feature on cell phone tracking produced by the Berlin Green Party politician Malte Spitz, I'm happy to say is here with us tonight. After learning that Deutsche Telekom was tracking its customers minutely and storing months of data on their movements, Spitz asked to see what the company had on him. When Deutsche Telekom refused, he sued and eventually got his data in 35,830 lines. With the help of Zeit Online, Spitz, oh, I should have done this already. Let's see. Can we get this going? Yeah. I want to show it to you if it comes up. Okay. Here we go. With the help of Zeit Online, Spitz turned this data into a striking and atmospheric animation, illustrating the seamlessness of routine mobile phone tracking of a kind that applies to every one of us. This, of course, was in 2011, an eternity ago, it seems, in the era before Snowden. Today, who among us imagines that we take a step phone in pocket without roiling the data? The environment I'm describing is contemporary, but I want to make the case that the story of data goes back quite a bit further, even several centuries further, and that we can learn something about the idea of data from taking a longer perspective. To do this, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to make a big jump back to the 17th and 18th centuries. And rather than focus on data practices, though I will discuss that some, I want to focus on what we mean and what we have meant when we talk about data, to try to understand how data, which seems to be about a world, ultimately came to constitute one. Let's see if I can get back. Good. So, and by the way, there are some jokes in here, but occasionally it'll go a little deep. So, you know, relax. Be here for a few minutes. In a pamphlet on magnetism from 1761, the little remembered and little lamented scholar and inventor Temple Henry Croker makes the following intriguing statement. Until experimental philosophy was introduced, all science was founded upon data. Now, without some context, it's quite hard to discern what Croker could possibly have meant. From a modern perspective, at any rate, Croker's statement appears to have its terms completely reversed. For Croker, the abandonment of data was the crucial and definitive step toward modern science. Though Croker made no great contribution to the history of science, Benjamin Franklin, who read the pamphlet on magnetism, summarily rejected it as founded upon a mistake. Croker's statement about data was, in fact, much less strange than it appears in retrospect. Croker did not maintain that experimental philosophy rejected data in the sense of the term today. To the contrary, he used data as a synonym for principles a priori. To Croker, a datum was an axiom given prior to experimental investigation. Croker was himself an experimentalist, and much of his work, including his research into perpetual motion and his studies for the construction of a horizontal windmill, hinged on the collection of what we would now conventionally refer to as data. Further scientific advance, Croker writes, I quote, must result not from fancy, but from facts, not from artfully devised systems, but from real experiments and facts, not data. Odd as it seems, Croker's usage was not anomalous. For Croker, as for many other writers in his day, including John Wesley and Tobias Smollett, data still meant what it did in Latin, something given, whether a fact or a principle. But in the 1760s, assumptions about what constituted givenness were themselves changing. These shifts enabled a usage different from what we find in Croker and that was already flourishing at the time. In some important ways, we may say that by 1760, a modern concept of data had been born. If Croker, Wesley, and Smollett strike us as odd, the same is not true for the usage we find in a 1775 letter by Benjamin Franklin, which deploys the term data with some irony to describe a calculation of costs and benefits of the war between the English armed forces and the rebellious American colonists. Franklin writes, and it's great because I don't have to do this joke, he does it. Franklin writes, "Tell our dear friend, Mr. Price, who sometimes has his doubts and despondencies about our firmness, that America is determined and unanimous, a very few Tories and placemen excepted, who will probably soon export themselves. Britain, at the expense of 3 millions, has killed 150 Yankees in this campaign, which is 20,000 pounds a head. And at Bunker Hill, she gained a mile of ground, half of which she lost again by our taking post on Plowed Hill. During the same time, 60,000 children have been born in America. From these data, his mathematical head will easily calculate the time and expense necessary to kill us all and conquer our whole territory." It's good to have good writers rely on. Here, data refers to quantitative facts gathered through observation and collection, which are then subject to mathematical and financial manipulation. That Franklin might use the term so casually in a letter, and moreover with irony, strongly suggests that he took his usage to be transparent, if perhaps still neologistic. Croker's evident labor in employing the term suggests at least a hint to the contrary. And we may make parallel observations about a social satire from 1760. Sarah, now advanced to her 76th year, was, had she been stretched out to her utmost length, about 5'3" honest measure. As she was generally seen making an obtuse angle from her middle of about 95 degrees, 36 minutes, it will be easy for mathematicians to compute the length of the line they imagine will be extended from the tip of her coif to the toe of her shoe. But as this is a matter of science out of my reach, I can but show my goodwill by assigning these data, little doubting that my second edition of this third volume will contain the calculation at length to 1/millionth part of a hair's breadth. For the author, data stands as a figure for empirical quantitative science in both its usual practice and in its excess, the beachhead of the calculator in the fields of social life. From the 1760s, this new characterization was taking off. As it turns out, and I will soon be showing you some quantitative evidence for this, the late 18th century was a time of greatly increasing chatter about this strange object, data. In point of fact, this is where my whole project began. It was a few years ago, and I was finishing up the book on timelines that I did with Tony Grafton when I started to notice it. The very first time was here in the 1788 Lectures on History and General Policy by the very interesting natural philosopher and theologian Joseph Priestley. He was a good friend of Franklin, and from the 1790s through to his death in 1804, a political refugee in the United States. Priestley's use of the term data struck me particularly because he was talking about historical information, principally names and dates, like the ones that he used in constructing this, his famous chart of biography from 1765. While I could imagine data being used in the 18th century in studies of population or finance, I was surprised to find a discussion of something called historical data in the period. Of course, I didn't begrudge Priestley his use of the term, it just seemed very early. So much so that when I went back to my notes from Cartographies of Time a couple of years later to do this, I somewhat doubted my own transcription and had to go back to the original. Of course, if you were to pick an 18th century figure likely to be interested in data, Priestley is about as good a choice as you might make. After all, Priestley was an early innovator in the field we now call data graphics. Furthermore, he was an empiricist and an experimentalist. Among his many achievements, the isolation of oxygen from air in 1774 is only the best remembered. And he brought an interest in aggregate phenomena to the many domains in which he researched and wrote. In his historical works, both diagrammatic and textual, Priestley was not only interested in individual facts, when was Newton born, when did he die, but in large constellations of information. Assigned to teach a general history course at the Dissenting Academy in Warwick in the early 1760s, Priestley applied the intuitions of a scientist to his work, seeking to examine the fields of human endeavor quantitatively, grouping historical figures by their domains of achievement and plotting their lives on a measured timeline in order to observe patterns of occurrence and variations in density. In fact, data appears in Priestley's work many times. In his experiments and observations on different kinds of air, Priestley uses data to refer to experimental measurements. In the evidences of revealed religion, Priestley notes that Scripture offers us no data on the physical nature of Christ's resurrected body. In his essay on a course of liberal education for a civil and active life, Priestley talks about educational data in a way that makes him sound like he's applying for a grant from the Gates Foundation. Nor is Priestley unique in this. The term data appears in a wide variety of contexts in 18th century writing. But what were these early usages? What was their importance in the language and culture of the 18th century? And what is their connection to the usages that are familiar today? It's actually a bit curious, I think, that we don't know more of the answers to these questions already. During the past decade, we've seen excellent books published on several sister terms, including facts, truth, and evidence. Lorraine Daston here in Berlin has referred to this kind of scholarship as historical epistemology, and it's a thriving field. What is more, in these studies, the term data does some very heavy lifting, and yet it is rarely remarked. Consider, for example, the first lines of Mary Puvey's foundational study, A History of the Modern Fact. What are facts? Are they incontrovertible data that simply demonstrate what is true? Or are they bits of evidence marshaled to persuade others of the theory one sets out with? Facts in her account may be conceived as either theory-laden or as simple and incontrovertible. In the latter case, we call them data. Of course, it would not be hard to engage in some one-upsmanship. If facts can be deconstructed, if they can be shown to be theory-laden, surely data can be too. But it's not clear that such a move would help us very much. Above all, it's crucial to observe that the term data serves a different rhetorical and conceptual function than do the sister terms facts and evidence. To put it more precisely, in contrast to these other terms, the semantic function of data is specifically rhetorical. I'm going to come back to this a few times. So, what was data prior to the 20th century? And how did it acquire this pre-analytical, pre-factual status? In this, etymology is a good starting point. The word data comes to us in English from Latin. It is the plural of the Latin word datum, which is itself, some grammar for you, the neuter past participle of the verb dare, to give. A datum in English, then, is something given in an argument, something taken for granted. This is in contrast to fact, which derives from the Latin verb meaning to make or to do, so that a fact is something that was done, occurred, or exists. The etymology also contrasts with that of evidence from the Latin verb to see. The distinctions here are important. Facts are ontological. Evidence is epistemological. Data, something given in an argument, is rhetorical. A datum may also be a fact, just as a fact may be evidence, but from its first vernacular formulation, the existence of data has been independent of any consideration of truth in the world. A fact proven false ceases to be a fact. False data is data nonetheless. And this is both, I think, true conceptually, and it's also true in usage. And the distinction echoes through all of the different ways in which facts and data are used in the language. So I won't talk about it much in this talk, but one of the things I'm doing is something called collocation analysis, where you look at how words co-occur. And a kind of neat example of how different these words that seem so similar turn out to be is a phrase like bad data. You can have bad data, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about bad facts. Similarly, you can talk about unfortunate facts, but not really unfortunate data. And the charts that I put up are just n-grams of those pairs, and you see that bad data squashes bad facts, and Google totally freaks out when you look for unfortunate data and just says, I don't know what that is. In English, data is a fairly recent word, though not as recent as one might guess. The earliest use of the term, discovered by the Oxford English Dictionary, occurs in a 1646 theological tract that refers to a heap of data. It's notable that this first OED citation is to the plural data, not the singular datum. While datum also appeared in 17th century English, its usage was limited then as it is limited now, and many linguists doubt that datum has become a word in English in the way that data did. Data did not move from Latin to English without comment. Already in the 18th century, stylists argued over whether the word was a singular or a plural, and whether a foreign word of its ilk belonged in English at all. In Latin, data is always a plural, but in English, even in the 18th century, common usage allowed data to function either as a plural or as a collective singular. Guides differ, and people differ angrily about this, but usage authorizes both. An analogy to parallel Latin words gives no unambiguous guide. Indeed, it seems preferable in modern English to allow context to determine whether the word should be treated as a plural or as a collective singular, since the connotations are really very different. The fact that a standard English dictionary defines a datum as, quote, a piece of information, which refers to another mass noun, further strengthens this intuition that there really is something important about thinking that data can be a mass noun. As Steven Pinker argues, however much priggish pleasure we may take in correcting our friends for treating data as a singular noun, when it is a plural in Latin, obviously, our reasoning does not stand scrutiny. Foreign plurals are very often deployed in English as singulars. Were they not, we would be incorrect in referring to an agenda, an insignia, or a candelabra. Moreover, Pinker writes, quote, whenever pedants correct, I love Pinker for this stuff, whenever pedants correct, ordinary speakers hypercorrect, so that the attempt to foist proper Greek and Latin plurals has bred pseudo-erudite horrors such as axia, more than one axiom, peni, rhinoceri, and octopi. None of these exists in the source language, and in the case of the last, I quote again, it should be octopuses. The US in octopus is not the Latin noun ending that switches to I in the plural, but the Greek pous, P-O-U-S, foot. The etymologically defensible octopodes is not an improvement. And on our collective singulars, this is an article I enjoyed from The Atlantic. Obama gives these speeches where he says in great 18th century diction, these United States. But Americans stopped saying these United States and started saying the United States around the time of the Civil War. And it gets people very mad. However controversial they may have been, in 17th century English, neither data nor datum was particularly common. In these early years, the term data was still employed, especially in the realm of mathematics, where it retained the technical sense that it has in Euclid, as quantities given in a mathematical problem, as opposed to the quaesita, or quantities sought, and in the realm of theology, where it referred to scriptural truths, whether principles or facts, things that were given by God and therefore not susceptible to question. In the 17th century usage, the term data referred to precisely those sorts of information that were outside the realm of the empirical. These were God-given facts and principles that grounded the historian's ability to determine the quaesita of history. And this is one of these timelines from our book from 1718, and it stages the creation, which is one of these data, and then tries to determine some times that events in the Bible which aren't dated might have happened. These data were, by agreement, beyond argument. In different contexts, Such agreement might be based on self-evident truth, as in the case of biblical data, or on simple argumentative convenience, as in the case of algebra, let x equal 3, and so forth. The term data itself implied no ontological claim. In mathematics, theology, and every other realm in which the term was used, data was something given by the conventions of argument. Whether these conventions were factual, counterfactual, or arbitrary had no bearing on their status as data. So this is where I was in my research not very long ago. And in any past situation, my next steps would almost certainly have been hermeneutic. My usual plan would have been to read a lot more Priestley. And of course, I did that. But it occurred to me in this case, with this subject matter, it might also be appropriate, actually I thought it would be funny, to attempt a quantitative analysis of the usage of the term to try to write a quantitative history of data. So the rest of my remarks are about how much trouble you can get into for being so amused with yourself. On conceiving this next part of my project, my initial plan was to count occurrences of data in English, to specify when the word came into use as a Latin loan, when it was naturalized, when it achieved its various senses, and when it became an everyday word. Now, things have been changing very rapidly in the world of humanistic data during these past several years, and it happens that I performed this first round of quite strenuous quantitative work very shortly before Google publicly debuted the Google Books Ngram Viewer, the web-based tool that you've seen a few times in this talk already. The Ngram Viewer calculates relative word frequencies over time using a subset of the gigantic Google Books database as its corpus, which was precisely the sort of thing that I wanted to do for this project and that I was doing by hand in my study. The Harvard researchers who designed the viewer introduced it with a clever publicity strategy. They aimed both high and low, promoting it as both an amusing gewgaw and as a tool for serious scholarly research. In their January 2011 article in the journal Science, they present the Ngram Viewer as a tool for what they call culture-omics, quantitative cultural analysis modeled on genomics and the other omic fields booming in the natural sciences. This publicity strategy proved successful. This is Google Trends on the word Ngram. Suddenly it shoots up when they publish it. The publicity strategy proved successful, stirring up notice in key media venues such as the New York Times and in the blogosphere, where the ease of use and linking prompted a lot of kitchen culturomics. Briefly, it seemed that everyone was Ngramming. And there are just too many of these. I would love to show them all night and just not give the rest of my talk, but this one was from theatlantic.com. Everybody was doing this right then, and it just, it's compelling, isn't it? I thought it was going to be a zombie apocalypse. It turns out I'm wrong. That's what Google says. And this one was from Jezebel.com. And it's just too brilliant to say anything about. It just, I don't know. You see romanticism? I don't know. But the Harvard team got the ball rolling in their article with some provocative diagrams of their own. This is Science, journal, plotting the changing frequency of terms for a variety of people, events, and things. Galileo, Darwin, I'm quoting them now. Galileo, Darwin, and Einstein may be well-known scientists, they write, but Freud is more deeply ingrained in the collective subconscious. And in the battle of the sexes, women are gaining ground on the men. Even years themselves could be tracked through the corpus, displaying a frequency decay reminiscent of a radioactive isotope. Precisely what one makes of these word frequency trends is, of course, open to question. Women are not women, and I guess women are not women are not women. nor men, and I cannot recall any feminist fraction that ever sought preeminence in word frequency. Though if such a group ever existed, the data shows that they are doing a whole lot better than gaining ground. They've actually taken the field. Similarly, there are many reasons unrelated to something called collective memory, why the 1 gram 1960 might appear in a lot of documents from 1961. As for the implication that there is any such concept as a collective subconscious in Freud, suffice it to say that science was not sending this out to psychoanalysis scholars. There are many problems that occur moving back and forth between quantity and culture too easily, and there is great danger in thinking that data speaks for itself. These are difficulties I think we need to be particularly careful about in the humanities, since we don't yet have a collective critical background for encountering data. The point is not that we should avoid quantitative inquiry. To the contrary, it is pressingly urgent that we develop approaches to and critiques of data that draw on the strengths of the humanities. To do this, we need to be able to understand and to use the tools. Much more significant than the Ngram viewer on its own is the underlying data, which Google has made available for download so that scholars can run the numbers themselves without going through the Ngram interface. The open Google Books data will certainly produce new research. At the same time, I hope that it will elicit better formulated critiques of both the resource and the methods, and this is maybe a little start tonight. There's a great deal to say about all of this at the level of the construction of the corpus and the tools for searching it, and elsewhere I'm doing some of that work. But we don't need to get into any of this very far to see the potential difficulties. So consider a very simple example such as this. At a glance, one might be tempted to imagine that nuclear fear spiked around 1949 before leveling off into a more generalized anxiety. But add a second term to the search, and the second term here is nuclear weapons, and that guess pretty well falls apart. Or does it? Maybe a third term would tip the scales back in the other direction. Okay, let's get back to data. So at the time that I began my research for this study, the Google Ngram viewer was not yet available, and although it was possible to produce results like Ngram results by hand, and I think I showed you an image of that before, a handmade Ngram that I did by just querying Google with a date-limited search over and over and over again. Although it was possible to produce similar results by hand at that time, Google Books offered neither the most obvious nor the most promising corpus with which to conduct a study such as this. And in any event, I didn't begin with Google Books, but rather with the academic database called 18th Century Collections Online, or ECHO. So this is the ECHO interface. ECHO is in many ways a primitive tool, and it suffers from many of the faults for which Google Books is constantly derided, including bad scanning quality and bad OCR. But ECHO has some notable advantages too. Its corpus is large enough, comprising close to 200,000 unique titles, a drop in the bucket compared to the 5 million titles that are sampled by the Ngram viewer and the 40 million titles that are there in Google Books, but an important and well-curated group of titles amounting to nearly all of the books that were published in England in the 18th century, which is saying something. Additionally, ECHO is well-defined and much more stable than Google Books. ECHO's sources are well-chosen, well-known and accessible. Its out-of-the-box search functions are better. And the metadata is incomparably better because these are based on library records. So you get real research-level stuff in it. So using ECHO, I began to try to understand the sense of data in Priestley. Happily, my first searches turned out to be promising. On the one hand, ECHO results are consistent enough with those of Google. Speaking from a strictly quantitative point of view, Google is right. The big data takeoff is unquestionably a post-Enlightenment phenomenon. Google shows data increasing through the 19th century and then exploding around 1940 and going up, up, up after that. On the other hand, the echo data shows clear trends. Oh, and I should say, these slides got a little out of order, but in the big engram from 1700 to the present for data, what you get is a flat line through the 18th century, and then you start to see data tick up in the 19th century, and then the explosion around the Second World War. But echo, on the other hand, shows clear trends in usage in the 18th century that laid the foundations for all of the later developments and that are impossible to perceive using Google. The 18th century produced important new ways of thinking data, and our friend Priestley was situated felicitously just exactly where those new ways of thinking happened. The echo numbers are interesting, and they're also surprising in their clarity given the Google Books results, which suggest, the Google Books results suggest that the strong trends in the history of data begin in the 19th century and accelerate in the 20th. It's hard to blame Google for stumbling on data. It's actually a very hard word to search. For one thing, it's constantly showing up in metadata. So, for example, if you search Project Gutenberg for books that contain the word data, you get a list of every book in Project Gutenberg because it's there in the metadata. Same thing if you search in WorldCat. WorldCat puts data in all the archival records. So you get all of these false hits. For another, the word data is not common enough in 18th century usage to overcome the limits of the Google corpus for that period. And Google is quite upfront that their 18th century corpus is weak compared to what comes after. Data was neither especially common nor especially rare in 18th century English. For comparison, a simple full-text search of echo for the word truth produces hits in 82% of titles. Evidence shows up in 49%, fact in about 28%. A strict analysis of data produces a number closer to 3% at century's end. It also turns out that during the 18th century, most appearances of the 1 gram data are in fact Latin, even when they appear in English language books. This fact alone largely accounts for the invisibility of the rise of data in the 18th century in the n-gram viewer. So what's happening is, I think I have this line in a little bit later, but what's happening is that there's more and more usage of data in English, but there's less and less Latin being published in English books, and the two things balance each other out, so what you get is a flat line. You get the same number of instances of the 1 gram data, even though you're getting actually an explosion in usages in English. There are other complicating factors too. For example, there are a lot of 18th century hits that refer to the title of Euclid's book on data. There are a large number of hits that are OCR errors, where the word in the original is date. In one very charming instance, the Echo search engine pulls up a reference to a certain king data, a giant who fattened his 25 children by feeding them on puddings stuffed with enchanted herbs. It's my next book. But it's the Latin hits, here it is, that really confound the n-gram viewer, since the rise of data as a discourse object coincides exactly in timing and quantity with the decline of Latin in England. For every additional instance of data in English in the 18th century, there's one fewer instance in Latin, resulting in the flat curve. As a consequence, it has been useful to examine the hits individually, to sort the good from the bad, and to code them, to engage in a constructive process of data making, so well described in recent ethnographies of scientific practice. My own data may once have been raw, but by the time I began any serious interpretation, like Old King data, I had done a good deal of cooking. My skills in magic, however, I'm still working on. Because the number of meaningful search hits for data in Echo turned out to be only 2,300, give or take, it was possible to read them all, to code them according to several protocols, and to produce very rich records for each instance. It was also possible to read extensively in the source works, to gain a more nuanced understanding of context. And this allowed me to pose a lot of questions about the term and the key trends. And while this research is not yet complete, there are some strong, I think, preliminary results. So I want to highlight 4 of these very briefly and then conclude. So first, Good. First, the word data entered the English language in the 17th century and was naturalized in the 18th. There are a number of different quantitative and qualitative sources of evidence for this, and the evidence is unambiguous. The number of books in which the English word data appears rises from 0.3% total in the first decade of the 18th century to 3% of total in the last. While this tenfold increase in relative frequency did not make data common, it did make it familiar, as we've seen in Franklin and the satire and elsewhere. Moreover, at the beginning of the 18th century, the term data was italicized in the vast majority of cases, 88%, an indication that the word in 1700 was still considered Latin. By the end of the century, data was italicized in only 19% of cases. That is to say, by the end of the century, data had become English. Second point, the term data came into English principally through discussions of mathematics and theology, roughly 70% of instances at the beginning of the century. At century's end, mathematics and religion accounted for only 20% of total instances, which were now dominated by empirical contexts such as those of finance, medicine, natural history, and geography. Third, over the course of the 18th century, the main connotations of the term data shifted. At the beginning of the century, data was used to refer either to principles accepted as the basis of argument or to facts gleaned from scripture that were unavailable to questioning. By the end of the century, the term was most commonly used to refer to facts and evidence determined by experiment, experience, or collection. It had become usual to think of data as the result of an investigation rather than its premise. Point number 4, and this is just one, I just like to be able to say this. We don't quite need that yet. We'll get it in a second. The OED is right and Google is wrong. Or at the very least, Google is not helpful on this question. There are definitive quantifiable trends in both the currency and the usage of the term data in the 18th century. Let me go back. You don't need to look at that yet. It took some fairly heavy work with the echo data to make these trends visible. But having done it, it is clear that the Oxford English Dictionary account of the term is mirrored in the quantitative results. For the moment, okay, here we go. For the moment, it's a win for 19th century reading practices. But it's not a victory that's likely to stand for long. Even the venerable OED is moving to embrace a data-driven approach, which must be as good a signal as any that we should all be ready to engage with the quantitative humanities in a strong, critical fashion. Among other things, as humanists, we need to pay much better attention to the epistemological implications of search, a new and already dominant form of inquiry with its own rules and its own notable blind spots. In any event, I do think that my eventual results will be good news for reading, even if they are not bad news for data. What is more, as we've seen with Priestley, the techniques made possible by the datafication of our literature are in so many ways consistent with ideas native to the 18th century. In other words, at least in examining this corpus, there is a pleasing echo of the primary material, such as the charts of Priestley, in the contemporary analytic techniques. To conclude, what does the history of the term data have to tell us about data today? There are a number of possible answers to this question, but one I think is worth particular attention. This observation is supported by the numbers, but not generated by them. From the beginning, data was a rhetorical concept. Data means, and it has meant since it came into English, that which is given. As a consequence, data serves as a kind of historical and epistemological mirror, showing what, in any period, we take for granted. Without changing meaning during the 18th century, data changed its referent. It went from being reflexively associated with things outside of any possible process of discovery to being the very paradigm of what one seeks through experiment and observation. Because data matters so much in our world, because it feels at once ubiquitous, mysterious, and new, it is tempting to want to give data an essence, to define exactly what kind of fact it is. But this misses the most important reason why the word is useful. The data concept was innovated as a way of setting aside questions of ontology. It reemerged at the center of our general culture because in the end, it produced ontologies of its own. Thank you.
Please ask him all the questions that have come to your mind.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to know data as a sign of how, when in this concept, data will be affect.
Can you say that again? I'm not sure I followed it.
Okay, when is data, when data will be affect, a history fact.
When is data a fact?
Yeah, and as data, as you told about it, can I see as a sign? Semiotical.
Right. Data are signs, and I mean, okay. So this is a super complicated question. It's a short question, but a very complicated one. So let me start with the facts. Data are facts whenever they're used as facts. The critical thing to take away from this is that data need not be factual. You can have a database that is filled with erroneous information, and it's still your data set. It's still your data set, and not only is it still your data set, but it can be an incredibly important data set and an incredibly effective data set in the world. And we see that in things like stock market crashes and Enron scandals and all sorts of situations where data which is not factual nonetheless functions as a fact in the world, nonetheless has effects as if it were factual, because data has its own ecosystem and data has its own ontology. So data is a kind of fact always, because all representations are facts, and I think this is the way to get back to to the other part of your question. Data is a fact of representation always, but that's not the kind of fact that people are usually thinking of when they say, there are two kinds of facts. There are facts that are theory-laden, and there are facts that are just true, and the true ones we call data. I think that's a mistake to think that what happens when we talk about data is that we get underneath the facts to the core stuff, to the stuff that isn't yet theory-laden, that hasn't yet been interpreted. I think that's wrong. I think that data are facts, but not of that kind. They're facts of representation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. You focus on, in this part of it, in any case, on English-speaking countries.
Yeah.
And I guess France is another area that you've looked at. What about in earlier times with historically dominant civilizations like Chinese or Arabian, or if you want, however you would call that, Islamic cultures? Is data in any way? The word derives from the Latin, but is there an equivalent? Is there a kind of a mirror image of that in those societies?
Not really. The data concept is new in the 17th and 18th centuries across languages and cultures in the sense that we're talking about it here. Now, that's not to say that the great empires didn't have a practical notion of data. Of course they did. These regimes were great data collection regimes. The invention of writing, the invention of tax rolls, all of these things are fundamental to the practical history of data. So, in terms of the history of practices, if I were telling that kind of story, yes. Let's start in Babylon. Let's start in Assyria. I mean, because in terms of the history of data practices, these are foundational moments. But what's interesting is that these cultures and civilizations did not need a distinction between facts and data. So, and you see, I mean, this is true. One of the pieces of the argument that's not fully articulated here is that, in fact, in the West, we really didn't need a distinction between facts and data in the sense that we use it today until the late 20th century. And what happens, I mean, it's quite an incredible story, because you see in the 18th century, the account I've given, you see the construction of this very sophisticated conceptual tool, this distinction between facts and data. They built it and no one came. Data throughout and this is there in the Google results, data throughout the 19th century is used increasingly more and more by scientists, social scientists, bureaucrats, engineers, and so forth. You see it there, but it's used in a very indifferent way. So you'll see in one line, the writer will talk about facts, and in the next line about data, and the next line about facts again. And there's not a lot of power in the word, so it gets used. Sometimes it distinguishes things that are numerical or quantitative from things that are qualitative, but it doesn't do a lot of work. And I think that part of the reason why data is available, why this 18th century distinction is really available when we get to the late 20th century, and we need to be able to talk about a realm of data which essentially has its own ontology, which isn't a correspondent, we're not talking about correspondent truths anymore. We're talking about the data is the data, whether it's true or not. One reason why the term data was available in the late 20th century was that 19th and 20th century science just had not been doing that much with it. They've been doing tons with data, but not much with this distinction. So I would make this is the same point about the ancient empires. Lots and lots of practical work with data, but not a lot of stress placed on determining the difference between things, facts, data, what have you. And Google gives you that straight through the 19th century. Daniel?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about your perspective on the politicization of the word data. Of course, you're not dealing with that, I know that.
Yeah.
But much interest is, of course, generated from the politicization.
Yeah.
And, it was instructive to that question was that graph, the end graph that you put up of nuclear weapons. Because maybe similarly, the politicization of nuclear or nuclear weaponry comes from a scientific sort of inquiry or has roots that way, but eventually becomes a political kind of discourse.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a very timely question. It is hard, and it is good hard work, but it is hard to politicize data. And this is the reason why I have Malte Spitz's stuff at the beginning of my talk. It's crucial work to politicize data and to understand that data always has a political dimension, but it's hard because, I had this, we had a reception here last week, and I was talking to Mary Shapiro, who's visiting the former chair of the SEC, and I think Hillel had been talking to her and said, she's fascinated by big data. It's one of the central things that she does. You should talk together. And I said, why are you interested in big data? Why does it matter to you so much? And she said, I'm a lawyer. She said, I'm not a numbers person. I'm a lawyer, and I got this job, and I got it in the middle of the financial crisis in the U.S. And everybody was stuck. No one would do anything. Everything was politicized. And she said, the only way I could get people to talk to each other was by depoliticizing things, by making everything about the data. And so she brought in all these quants, so this is good for her, we survived. But this is a problem, I think, because that's the cultural reflex, is to assume that when we go to the data, we get outside of politics.
The word itself is
Yeah.
political at this point. The word itself is being used as a political sort of sign as well.
I have a couple of instances of that in mind, but please tell me what you're thinking of.
Well, data mining, NSA, it has already a kind of attachment to positions that are outside. I mean, because you really did sort of, as Wolf suggested, it's a cool approach to the word itself. There's a natural warming that takes place in the current atmosphere of the word itself. So I'm curious about your perspective of that, because there's an attachment to it that's unavoidable in some ways. When the word comes up, if someone says, kind of mass data mining, it already has massive political implications.
Yeah, I think it does, but I think it's hard to pin down. I mean, I think we're talking about a field that's changing a lot, and I mean, again, I said in my talk that it was quite sobering to me when I was constructing this talk, because, I apologize. I'm sorry I gave you history when you probably came to hear about today, but when I was going through and trying to figure out what contemporary stuff I wanted to put in, I was going through my notes, and I would look at things from 2011, 2012, and they look so old. Particularly, I think in a lot of ways there's really a break at Snowden in the way that we see the world. And so, Malta's piece, when I saw it in Insight Online, that was in 2011, I was like, whoa, And then, I wonder now if I would have that same reaction. And it was the same thing with the Target knows you're pregnant thing. I mean, that article, I mean, it's so creepy because it's not just creepy the Target knows you're pregnant, that's okay. What's creepy is that they know that you don't want to know that they know. And so they manipulate their communications through email and direct mailings and all of those things. So they want to give you the coupons, but they don't want you to think that they know that they're giving you the coupons because you're pregnant. And so they mix in, fertilizer and whatever else. It's really weird stuff. But there's this. I don't think we know where those valences are headed. I gave a talk at the National U.S. Quantified Self meetup 2 years ago. I don't know if you guys know about this. This is a global association of, what's it?
I said we don't know that.
You don't know. It's all these people who do self-tracking, whether it's Nike Fit Band, or Nike Fuel, or the Fit Band, or sleep data, or whatever. It's all these people who are into tracking themselves, it's very powerful there because there's this alternation because these people are deep into data and they want lots of them want their data out in the world. The key thing is that, in fact, in that discourse is having access to your own data rather than having data privacy, having data access. So it's not that you don't want Corporation X to know something about you. It's that you want the right to know what Corporation X knows. So pushing very strongly in that direction for a different kind of data freedom, a different vision that's not based on kind of older concepts of privacy. So I think that when you're in this field, it's not clear, I think, whether when you say data mining, I think it's not clear that we say that today. We hear data mining, we probably think, big entities, NSA, Target, whomever, taking our data, making data about us. But I'm not sure that that's stable. I'm not sure it's going to stay that way. Yeah, Hillel.
I'd like to take the question of quantification one step farther. Have you done any work on how the word and concept of data itself has been quantified. So for example, when did people begin to talk about meager data or lots of data?
Yeah.
At what stage did data
Yeah.
itself need that adjective?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is very fun stuff, and yes, I've looked at a lot of it because right, I created this little database of 2,300 instances in the 18th century, and somebody's laughing out here, and read it and reread it, and you see, you notice the friends that data makes, the other words it makes friends with, and in the 18th century, data really likes negative words. Insufficient data, for want of data, in need of data. It's all like that. And I thought at first I was just seeing something, but I tallied them up. This became one of those columns of coding. I tallied up the negative instances, and then I looked at this as we went forward into the 19th and 20th centuries, and it's really quite true that in the 18th century. The data concept is used. It's a kind of ideal, and usually, I mean, very typically, when these 18th century books are talking about data, it's about data that they don't have. There's a fantasy that a certain kind of empirical science may be articulated, may be developed, which could produce a certain kind of data, and so data names this kind of desideratum. It's not very often used for talking about the stuff that we have in front of us. And for that, once you've done your experiment and you have your stuff, very often people are talking about facts and things and numbers and counts and what have you. That changes, and I have some nice charts on this. It really changes in the 20th. It really doesn't change very powerfully in the 19th century. It really changes in the 20th. With the emergence of data networking and databasing and all of these modern electronic devices and techniques that produce the data that we normally think of when we talk about data, when that culture comes online after 1950, now you have data sets in front of you. And there's this sort of equilibration, and so the negative and the positive usages balance out. And so we're no longer in a world where data is wanting, we're actually in a world of data plenitude. And it's kind of neat that you can see that in these words of quantification and in these words of presence and absence that align themselves with the word.
So the word too much data.
Yeah, too much data would be a 20th century articulation. We can go do this afterwards if you want and have some fun with it, but I'm tempted. I don't want to get into more slides, but I actually have the slides farther down in the presentation showing. So the way that I did the comparison is I looked at data and facts in the 18th century, and I said, what are these phrases? The negative phrases: for want of data, mere data, insufficient data, and then I put the same collocations with facts, and I said, for want of facts, mere facts, insufficient facts, and data was wildly more negative. And then as you move into the second half of the 20th century, the usages parallel exactly. They come right together. And so data in the late 20th century earns a new kind of positivity. It becomes something which prior to 1950, but really prior to 1970, it didn't have. Let's go way in the back and then move our way up.
Thank you, Ken, for the fascinating analysis. What you said, your analysis is all based on the English language, although somebody brought up France, and I haven't really seen the analysis into the French language. And there are two reasons for doing that. First of all, French was the lingua franca for science and much of the intellectual communications. And the other reason is that French, like Latin, is a Romance language. Yes. So it's not as alien to Latin as English is. So it might be different, right? Yeah. And I imagine that this an analysis of the French language would be much harder because Google Books is very weak on French books, and then there's no comparable database. It's like Echo for the French language, and I think the closest is the Gallica, the French National Library database, but it's much smaller in terms of size. So could you do the analysis on that?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question, and it has two dimensions. One is about the comparative question in general, and the other is France in particular. And so the short answer to the comparative stuff is it's really important to do some comparative work, and I have done some of that work. I'll tell you just a little bit about it. On the other hand, there are and I'll come back to French in a second too. There are reasons to privilege English. Well, so here's the way to get back around to it. In Europe in the 18th century, there's a kind of funny bifurcation. The data is articulated in the different European languages either using the Latin word, data, or using vernacular words. And French is one of the languages where a vernacular word is used. So in French, it's just givens in French, les données. That's it. And so sort of a funny thing happened on the way to this usage, which is that, and that split, by the way, basically the Romance languages is very surprising. The Romance languages basically all use vernacular terms, and the German language, the Northern European languages all use Latin. I don't know why that happens. That's mysterious, but it does. And so what happens in French and the other Romance languages is that you don't get as sharp and effective a conceptual differentiation between data and facts, let's say, as you get in English and the other languages that use this foreign word. And that's actually a fairly common linguistic phenomenon where you have a foreign word that marks out a kind of different conceptual territory. In the 20th century, and again, the key action is after about 1970, in the 20th century, it turns out that these languages that weren't using data need it. And so French and the other Romance languages start borrowing data from English. And it starts competing with les données. And the French don't like English words being imported into French, but this is a very ironic case where the English word being imported is Latin. The work can be done in French. It's not Gallica. For the 18th century, the really beautiful resource is Artful. It's much smaller than these other databases, but it's so much more statistically powerful because it was built from the beginning to be a linguistic database, not to be, a giant library or to be a service to sell you things or something else. So there is a very good way to do the work for France in the 18th century, and I've done some of that, and we can talk. But the arc, which is interesting to me, is that it turned out in the long run that les données was not enough. It turned out that after 1970, you kind of did need data. There are a whole bunch more hands, yeah. Sure.
I wonder, why did you call the term data a rhetorical term, whereas facts and truth and evidence are rhetorical too? Or what is the specificity of a rhetorical term for you?
Right. Well, it's a great point, and don't get me wrong. You're right that all of these terms are rhetorical, and when we're talking, the way that I would approach any of these terms is from the point of view of discourse. I would approach them indifferently from the point of discourse. So it's not that I think that that data is a different kind of word, let's say. It's rather that the claim that data makes, the importance of applying the concept historically, is that you identify a certain kind of information, a certain kind of representation, if you will, a certain kind of sign. You identify it as belonging, as having a certain role in an argument. That's what you do when you call it data. You say, for the sake of this argument, we will accept this. We will take this stuff, whatever it is, for granted. But that's different from the claim that facts make, and it's different from the claim that evidence makes, because when you call something a fact, you're saying that it really is out there in the world. It's something. And data could be something. It could be that, you know, when Euclid sets up a problem and says 3 + 4 = x, or 3, what have you, when Euclid said let x equal 3 for the following equation, it could be that Euclid had just been outside counting apples. And those were real, and so it's that 3, it refers to facts in the world. But it doesn't matter for Euclid. So that's the distinction that I want to make. Both evidence and facts, both of those concepts make claims about what's really out there in the world, and data doesn't. And that's why I think data becomes so important in our world.
I wonder if you don't have to go a step further at this point. I mean, granted that you look at this as a rhetorical device.
Yep.
So that's the thing that stays the same over time. And then you describe quite impressive changes that have occurred. What data refers to. In the beginning, it refers to given things that are kind of unquestionably given. So they are taken as datum, as something that's coming from God or whatever, something. And then later, there is a time in which, as you said, that the search for good data, you want more data. So now the question is, as a historian, don't you want to ask the question, so what does that change? This is a major change. What kind of societal change is reflected in that change?
Well, I think it's an open question. It's a really hard question. It's one of those, you know, as a historian, not a prognosticator, I think it's very difficult to answer. I think that you know, we live in a world in which data is a kind of commodity. And it's an amazing thing to think about, because once again, you know, we don't know, and in an important way, we don't care if data represents real stuff in the world, so long as it's effective. So it's an amazing thing that you know, people trade in this. What is it? Hewlett-Packard just divided into 2 companies, so that they could have a company that was only a data company, so that the data was now separated from the stuff. And all this was just a week or 2 weeks ago, and all the business press says, everybody's going to do this now. The stuff is going to be somewhere, and the data is going to be somewhere else, in an entirely separate company. So you know, it's a huge question. What kind of world is it when data earns an ontology, builds an ontology of its own? We'll find out. We'll find out also because people like Malta are doing the work. He's actually coming out with a book in a week, which is he's looked at what he's one of these you know, data freedom people, and so he went around and he forced everybody to give them their data on him, and he's written a book about sort of how he is constituted as a data subject. So the studies need to be done, and I think the future is uncertain. Yeah, right here you had a hand before.
Just getting back to the rhetorical, I had the same hesitation around it. If we did a kind of quantitative study of your talk, you used the rhetorical, you used only in relationship to the word data.
Yeah.
And I love the talk, but find myself hesitating because you present the dilemma of you would have normally, I think if I understood you right, done a more hermeneutic analysis. Instead, you did a quantitative one, and then suffer the sort of trials of that thought. But it seems to me an alternative would be, for lack of a better word, more philosophical approach. And actually, it seems to me your kind of meta-analysis of your own work tends to be more philosophical in character than either historical, hermeneutic, or quantitative. And the only way I can get into that is a little bit when you looked at the roots of the given, the made, and to be seen. It seems to me that what your quantitative analysis reveals is that the word data, as a word, is vibrating between given, made, and seen. And because from a philosophical perspective, it's quite hard to imagine those being able to be separated. And of course, what could be considered to be possibly given or made or seen would evolve historically, and therefore the word data may evolve, but data might have a relatively consistent sort of responsibility to the vibration between made and seen. And so let's just to sort of say it more quickly. If the word data itself is a visualization, because philosophically you could argue data by definition can't be seen, it can only be visualized. So the very word itself, beginning with the word data, creates the sense that there is this thing, data, which may or may not be accurate, may or may not be big or large. So a visualization, something that can be seen, triggers the reference to something that may have been found or may have been made. So and that seems to me the politics of it, that then there's a question of responsibility. So it's a kind of vague question, I know, but it has to do with why, or how do you decide when to, as it were, enter into the conversation of your own research, let's say more philosophically. And the only, your kind of confidence in the word rhetoric implies a kind of philosophical position on your part, that for example, it would seem that facts are different from non-facts. I mean, this is probably not a very helpful comment, but it is maybe the seduction of the word data has to do with this, its ability to never be so far away from finding, making, and seeing, right? And being a kind of, let's say, more like a knot.
Yep.
And your work seems to me traces the sort of shifting threads of the knot, but the knot actually seems relatively compact and consistent in English.
Well, it's a very interesting comment. I like the kind of the idea that data vibrates among these different values, positions, spheres, ways of seeing. And I think that's quite right. What to me is compelling, though, is, so you look at the 17th century. What to me is so compelling about the category of data in the 17th century is you look at it the way it's used in math, and you look at the way it's used in theology. And the ontological claims that are made by math and by theology are contrary to one another. And yet, both use the term data to do this kind of quarantining, to do this kind of argumentative quarantining, to say there are certain kinds of things, certain kinds of entities about which no questions will be asked. And it's opposite. The theologians do it because they know these things are true and real. And the mathematicians do it because it doesn't matter. These are just arbitrary values. And so to me, I mean, that's not a little vibration, that's a big vibration. That's an amazing transit from one side to the other. And so if this is a knot, it is a very stretched, capacious knot. I mean, we're talking like string theory stuff, because you're bringing together, or maybe you're talking about a circle or a sphere, and you're going all the way back around the other side, because you're talking about finding a common language, a common language and kind of a common strategy to talk about things that, from an ontological perspective, are incompatible with each other. And so to me, that's what's amazing about data. And to me, that's the vibration that carries forward. What's interesting to me about data today, as I've said, is that I think that it builds its own ontology, that there is a real factual existent world in data. And yet, it doesn't have to have anything to do with any other. I mean, it has effects on our world, but it doesn't have to represent our world. And so, funnily enough, I think that the 21st century moment, our usages of data are really kind of back to the future. I mean, in the 19th and 20th centuries, this is the hard part of the book to write because it's so boring. In the 19th and 20th centuries, data and facts are so close. They're so close. And data just doesn't matter that much because facts can carry so much of the work. And then you get to, after 1970, you get to our networked world. And now you need data again, but it's not the 19th century concept or the 20th century concept of data, it's the 17th and 18th century concept you need. So there's another big sort of string, that's wrapping around. We're not only bringing together values that are quite contrary, but there's this sort of atavism of the rediscovery of a concept that really, really mattered, and then for a long time didn't.
So I suggest that we thank Rosenberg for giving us